The discourse surrounding the Odyssey has been very interesting because it's become increasingly apparent to me over the years how so many of these leftists and so many of these activists and so many of these people in Hollywood really don't know the first thing about our history and how important these stories actually are. And it's kind of amazing, really, like how many people have released all these statements about how, oh man, it's just a story, bro, it didn't actually happen, it doesn't actually mean anything, and with history, it's just a movie, bro. When in actuality, the movie was made to produce a very specific narrative to diversify one of the most enduring pieces of media ever. And it's kind of crazy to see just how influential the Iliad and the Odyssey actually are, because recently I've been reading this history book about Alexander the Great, right? Macedonian king who conquered the Persian Empire. One of the OGs, one of the great military leaders, the absolute Giga Chad, Alexander. So, it was really interesting to me kind of reading a little bit about his early life and his interests and all that. And one of the things that really stuck out to me was how fond he was of Homer. So Alexander was really into poetry and the Iliad. Not so much the Odyssey, but he very much was a firm believer that the war actually happened and that he was directly descended from Achilles. And one of the things that interested me about this was that Alexander had a radically different perspective on the poems than we do, right? Because for him, a lot of it was we kind of focus on the tragedy of it and the emotional weight and the history. Alexander was big on glamorizing Achilles and glamorizing winning the war and glamorizing the heroes of the war, right? He wanted to die a death like Achilles, right? He wanted to die on the battlefield. So it really gives you a bit of perspective on how, with as our values change, our perspectives on this kind of thing change. But what doesn't change is how we are influenced by stories like this, because it's really interesting looking at this, looking at Alexander and how the Iliad kind of influenced him. It's very apparent to me that Alexander was a huge dork, because when you actually look at what he does, a lot of his strategies and a lot of his ideas come straight from the Iliad. There were times where he came up with strategies and ideas that were influenced by the Iliad, whether it was being overly aggressive when it comes to his campaigning, or whether it was a specific strategy. There were times where he straight up would come up with something that was influenced by the Iliad. And it's kind of interesting to me, because we always talk about the Trojan horse as a concept, and I believe it's debatable on whether or not it actually happened. But the fact of the matter is, both the Iliad and the Odyssey are so complex and so in-depth and cover so many real concepts that a lot of it can be applied to real-world situations. So because Alexander was so well educated in the ways of war, and because he was so familiar with Homer, he was able to come up with really unique methods of waging war, right? I'm reading about now how conventionally it was always seen as a bad idea to go to war in wintertime. But then Alexander, being an innovator and maybe being a little bit too bold, came up with the idea nobody's going to be expecting us to come in the winter, because how much of a bad idea it is, so we're just going to go ahead and do it anyway. And he made it work. You look at things like that, and you really get this sense of just how much these kinds of things influence culture and people, right? So even if they didn't literally happen, right, or if it was just the facts were embellished, which is tend to be how I look at the Trojan War, because I find it very difficult to believe that something like that didn't happen, considering like how much in line it is with like, actual thinking at the time, and how much of it like there seems to be evidence that something like it happened. But anyway, like, even if like it's not entirely true, like what you get is like the general idea persists and endures because it's rooted in like actual human history and culture, right? And I think that's like the really interesting thing we're seeing when it comes to this woke media, is that they keep trying to push diversity, they keep trying to push like feminism, they keep trying to push like wokeism, leftism, but like what they're trying to do is influence culture. They're trying to control culture, but like the reason why it's not working, the reason why it's not resonating with people is fundamentally because these ideas are not true. So like the Iliad and Odyssey may or may not be true. They may not be based on fact, but they are based on real things and ideas that people actually went through at some point in time, right? When it comes to like a lot of these movies, when it comes to a lot of these ideas, when it comes to a lot of like the propaganda we see in Hollywood, like Barbie, I think is a good example. What you get is something that nobody has ever gone through ever. When you look at like comic books, when you look at like DC or Marvel, like what you're dealing with are concepts and ideas that did not fucking happen and would never happen under any circumstances, right? Because they are so determined in pushing a specific social message that they don't have a really good perspective on like what people actually go through and what they would actually respond to and what actually, what experiences people have. It's very, very interesting, like how much they come in and try and like warp and subvert like all of these established brands to try and push their insane ideology, but like it all results in the same thing. And it's very interesting looking at the Odyssey, because right now the narrative is that like it's Christopher Nolan's highest grossing movie ever. This is going to go on to be like a masterclass of filmmaking. This is going to be going to go on to be an all-time classic. It doesn't matter how much the Odyssey makes, because at its core, I think it's just not going to hold up to the original story. Okay, it's not going to hold up to like the actual relevant piece of media. Like the idea that something like this could just replace that is just like completely insane and out of touch with reality. Like what we're seeing, I think, is the slow realization culturally that it doesn't matter how much something grosses at the box office. Like if people don't think something like this is real, they aren't going to respond to it. Like what we're seeing now is we're seeing a slow, gradual decline of Hollywood and its influence over culture. People used to think this was real. People used to think the celebrities were cool people. People used to think this was like an accurate representation of their own lives. And the reason why Hollywood has been falling off since the 80s is that people no longer think it's true. They no longer see it as fantasy. They no longer see it as wish fulfillment. Like they see it for what it actually is, like propaganda. And the more people see it that way, the more people understand like just how fake it actually is, the more people will reject it. And as a result of that, more and more people will gravitate more to other forms of entertainment. Entertainment that can't really be controlled by any centralized corporation. This is actually a really good point. The Warhammer 40K thing. A lot of people do this thing where they're just like, oh yeah, Warhammer 40K, it'll never be woke. It's too based. It's too red-pilled. Like, that's not really true, right? Because Games Workshop is extremely woke and compromised and has been for a long time. But, like, the problem is, like with D&D, because so much of it hinges on your own imagination, and because so much of it, like, revolves around this idea that, like, you're inventing your own stories, like, the fact of the matter is, the community is moving away from the officially established canon. Like, and the community's version of what Warhammer 40K is like way more popular than like the actual like game version. And that's the one that's going to survive like into relevancy. And there's not really anything the company can do to stop that. They tried to push female custodies onto people, to push their agenda. And from what I understand, they sold like 0 units, like zero. Like if the numbers I've seen are to be believed. So like when you look at things like that, when you look at like the history of like what's been happening over the past 40 years, like you can see like how random pieces of media, that initially don't do very well or are kind of niche or like underappreciated, like they kind of appreciate with time and are kind of seen as like, the beacon of like conservative values. Because it's interesting, like, throughout all of Rod Reida's career, right, he put out like Woke Subversive Slop, was an awful human being, spent his final years like bitching about Trump, only to die like a little bitch at the hands of his own son. The movie everyone's going to remember him for is The Princess Bride, because of just how much it resembles, it resonates with like actual conservative values and traditionalism, right? It feels a lot more real to people than a lot of other like bigger budget, more successful movies. Like, and I think that's going to stay that way for a long time. You see this with, we watched The Dark Crystal recently. Same deal. It's not like, it's interesting how like things like this still exist. They're still popular. They're still relevant. And yet like we enjoy them for what they are, and they kind of take on a whole meaning of their own, right? So when you look at Alexander, when you look at the Odyssey, like what you're seeing is history and ideas that can't really be like subverted or destroyed. Like it's not really possible to do it. Like what we're seeing by the establishment is an attempt at trying to do that, an attempt at trying to control the narrative, an attempt at trying to control this stuff, an attempt at trying to claim ownership of it. But what ends up happening is that like even if they like try and push like a woke, feminized like a translation of the Odyssey, Emily Wilson's, like what ends up happening is that everyone just rejects it and automatically defaults to the better version, and they can't fool people, who are casuals, because casuals just aren't going to read the Odyssey. It's just not going to happen. So what ends up happening is that the more educated, more capable, more passionate people are going to be like declaring which translation is more reliable. It's just getting harder and harder to like gaslight people, and like it's interesting to see how this year the narrative has been that this is the best year for Hollywood and forever, and this is a great year for theaters. To me, it's just them trying to take like get a second wind and try to retain their relevancy and try and trick people into coming back, because the writing has been on the wall for a long time, is that like nobody really wants to see this shit. If people went to go see the Odyssey, they went to go see it because of Christopher Nolan, not because they're passionate about the original poems, not because they're passionate about like Greek culture, not because they're like passionate about like history or like they just went to go see it because of Christopher Nolan. Just like how people went to go see a Brand New Day because of Spider-Man. All of this coping we've been seeing about how like these are huge successes. I don't think that's true. Like what we're seeing is people going out to the theater, trying to enjoy themselves, and like watching some slop. That's not good. That's not like engaging. That's not going to keep them invested. But like, they're just doing it just for the sake of doing it because of like, cultural reasons, right? That's not the same thing as people like, being strongly influenced by these properties, like the way Alexander was influenced by the Iliad. Like that is like the simple fact of the matter. Like that's the situation, is that Hollywood is not capable of creating something as timeless and iconic as Homer.